I want you to think about the last time you gave in on something you truly didn't want to give in on. And not something trivial like which movie to watch on Netflix on a Friday night, but something that really mattered to you. An opinion you softened because you noticed the atmosphere was getting tense, and you automatically decided it was better to soften your opinion than to stand your ground and defend it. A decision you left in someone else's hands because defending your own would have meant having a conversation that at that moment you maybe didn't want to have. A boundary you perhaps didn't set because you were afraid that setting that boundary would be interpreted as maybe you don't love enough, as if you're cold, as if you're difficult, or even that it would diminish your worth as a woman. How much time passed from that moment until you realized you had given in? I don't know if it was hours, days, or if you didn't even notice because you've been in that pattern for so long that it feels so normal and you don't even realize when it happens anymore. There's an idea that circulates in 1,000 different versions but always says the same thing. Deep down, true love is shown through sacrifice. That total surrender is the ultimate proof, and that if you set boundaries, it's because you don't love enough. That if you think about what you need before thinking about what the other person needs, there's some selfishness in you that you should control better. So today I want to talk to you about how that idea, which is such a beautiful one, so normalized, and which many of us learned before we could even question it, has been one of the most effective tools of control over women, and how we learn to confuse submission with love, to confuse erasing ourselves with giving ourselves, to confuse boundaries with coldness. This is me, nothing more. I am Daniela Jácome. Welcome. So let's talk first about the word itself, because submission sounds very harsh. It sounds like something extreme, like obviously abusive situations, like a woman who literally does what she's told without questioning it. And there are people who will hear this and say, hey, but that's not me. I make my own decisions. And that can be completely true. But I'm not just talking about obvious submission. I'm talking about what I call structural submission, which is much more subtle than everyday submission, and that's why it's much harder to see. Structural submission isn't where you're forced to obey. It's the internalized, learned, and reproduced expectation, without anyone ever calling it an expectation, that your needs come after, always after. After those of your husband, your children, your family, your work, and anyone else to whom it's assumed you owe your availability. And that expectation became ingrained in many ways. In religion, where in many traditions women were presented as suitable helpers, as complements, but never as protagonists. In law, which for centuries treated married women as legal minors, incapable of signing contracts or making economic decisions without their husband's signature. Popular culture, which romanticized jealousy as love, control as protection, and possessiveness as a sign that you matter a lot to someone. And in everyday life, in the thousands of small messages you received about what makes a woman good, worthy, and also worthy of being loved. Messages that said, a woman who gives in is a woman who loves. A woman who demands is a difficult woman. A woman with boundaries is a cold woman. A woman who thinks of herself is a selfish woman. Now, I want to talk to you a little about the stories we've consumed, because these narratives are important, and they're important because we internalize them, and from childhood, they shape us in ways we may greatly underestimate. We only come to understand these patterns much later in real relationships. So I think about how many romantic movies, how many soap operas, how many stories presented as ideals of love have, at their core, a problematic man, cold, controlling, mysterious, even with a dark past, and a woman who, with her patience and love, transforms him. She heals him. She is good enough for him to change, as if our duty were to educate, change, heal, and mold. That narrative is what tells women, if he is like that, it's your responsibility to fix him. If you give enough, if you are patient enough, he will change. And if he doesn't change, it's because you didn't love enough, you didn't give enough, and you failed at something. You failed as a woman. But that's not love. That's putting the responsibility for someone else's behavior on the shoulders of the person receiving it. And it's a brutal trap, because the solution always requires you to do more, to give more, to endure more. And then, well, then there are the songs. How many song lyrics that we sing by heart talk about jealousy as proof of love, about possessiveness as real proof that you matter to someone? If you loved me, you wouldn't talk to anyone else. You're mine. Oh, I can't live without you. Phrases we hear in musical contexts accompanied by melodies that trigger positive emotions and leave an imprint of what real love is supposed to feel like. Real love doesn't turn you into property. Real love doesn't need to control you to feel secure. But if for years the images associated with love included those things, decoding them, of course, won't be automatic. It requires conscious effort. I'm going to go over some phrases that you've probably heard that you may have said and maybe even still say, not to judge, but so we can look at them clearly and see what's inside. Let's start with this one, which I love and is very common. I provoked him. This is one of the most dangerous because it turns the person who was harmed into the one responsible for it. And there is no provocation that justifies someone taking control over your body, your freedom, or your dignity. None. No, this is not up for debate, and there are no exceptions. Let's continue with, oh, that's just how men are. That sounds like a neutral observation, but in reality, it's an excuse disguised as realism. When you say, that's how they are, you're saying, that's how they have to be, and there's no alternative. We just have to accept it. Besides, it's unfair to the men who aren't like that because they do exist and they deserve not to be lumped together with the rest. And I have to confess on a personal note that I also find it very hard not to generalize when it comes to men, because yes, I've fallen into saying they're all the same. But well, like everything, it's a process, so let's continue. I don't want to be confrontational. And this one, I've personally said it myself. I've felt it myself. And what that phrase really says is, I learned that having my own voice at certain times creates problems, and I prefer to stay quiet rather than be labeled as the troublemaker. And listen, that turns silence into a virtue and having a voice into a flaw. That's another hidden trap right out in the open. I've also heard, it's better if I don't say anything so he doesn't get mad. This is chronic submission in its most everyday form. Permanently adjusting your behavior, your words, your needs to someone else's possible moods is living for someone else without ever calling it what it is: control. And this is another one I've heard so many times. If I loved him more, it wouldn't bother me so much. Love is not anesthesia. Feeling that something is wrong in a relationship is not a lack of love. It's a healthy response from a person who respects themselves. The problem isn't your reaction, the problem is what caused it. I'd like to take this opportunity to remind you that a relationship involves two people. So it's important that in order to find a balance between what we both want and how we want to feel, both of us can learn to negotiate, to compromise, and to find middle ground. And here I want to clarify something extremely important because I don't want what I'm saying to sound like relationships should be a constant battleground or that compromising is always bad. Compromising in a relationship is not necessarily a bad thing. Negotiation, compromise, and flexibility are fundamental parts of any real connection. No one can live in a relationship where they never give in to anything. That's not autonomy, it's an inability to relate to others. The problem is when giving in becomes a one-sided pattern, when you're always the one who yields, when no one explicitly asks you to, but everyone automatically assumes you will. When giving in starts to cost you pieces of yourself that don't just grow back on their own. When one day you realize you don't even know what you want, because you've spent so long prioritizing what others want, that your own desires have become quieter, blurrier, until you can barely hear them anymore. That isn't love, that's dissolution. And the thing is, for a long time, unfortunately, society taught us to call it love so that we would accept it without questioning it. A healthy relationship has room for two whole people, not for one complete person and a satellite that constantly adjusts its path according to the other's gravity. And if in any of your relationships you feel like you're the satellite, it's not time to judge yourself for having ended up there, But it is time to ask yourself how you got there and what you need to build something completely different. So that's what I want you to take away today. Setting boundaries isn't about not loving, it's about telling someone that what we have together matters enough to me to be honest about what I need for this to work. It's about treating myself with the same respect that I treat you. A boundary stated clearly, without aggression, with respect. That is an act of love toward the other person because you give them real information about who you are, and toward yourself, of course, because you allow yourself to exist with your own needs within the relationship. People who truly care about you won't fall apart when you set a boundary. Can it lead to an uncomfortable conversation? Of course, but the bonds won't break. And if those bonds do break when you express what you need, that's very valuable information about that relationship. And it's important for you to analyze it to see if it's worth continuing with that kind of connection. So today, I want to leave you with the episode's question. In which relationship in your life have you given in so much, so often, that one day you realized you no longer knew what you wanted? How did you get there? And what was the first thing you felt when you saw it clearly? Lastly, I want to tell you that the difference between giving yourself and disappearing is fundamental. Love does not ask you to erase yourself, and if it does, it's not love. It's control with a pretty name. This is just me. Don't forget that I am Daniela Jácome. We'll talk again soon.